Hello dear fellow time traveler of knowledge. Step into the Artificial History channel as we unravel the mysteries of the past and shed light on our world today.
And in today's video we are going to talk about Ancient Egypt, unraveling the mysteries of the Nile Valley. Journey back in time to the banks of the mighty Nile River, where a civilization of unparalleled grandeur and mystique flourished.
Ancient Egypt, with its majestic pyramids, enigmatic hieroglyphics, and timeless legacy, stands as a testament to the extraordinary achievements of human civilization. Join us as we embark on an enthralling expedition through the annals of history, exploring the captivating world of ancient Egypt, from its rise along the Nile to its enduring cultural and architectural wonders. Stretching back over 3,000 years, ancient Egypt represents one of the most awe-inspiring and enduring civilizations in the world. It emerged around 3100 BCE, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the legendary pharaoh Narmer, ushering in an era of political stability and cultural prosperity. Nestled along the fertile banks of the Nile River, ancient Egypt owed its success to the annual flooding that enriched its soil, enabling the cultivation of abundant crops such as wheat, barley, and flax. This agricultural surplus, coupled with sophisticated irrigation systems, provided sustenance for a burgeoning population and laid the foundation for a complex and hierarchical society. The pharaohs, considered divine rulers, governed Egypt with absolute authority and were revered as the intermediaries between the gods and the people. From the early dynasties to the New Kingdom, pharaohs such as Khufu, Hatshepsut, and Ramesses II left an indelible mark on the history of Egypt through their monumental constructions, grand expeditions, and diplomatic endeavors. Among the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt are the pyramids, colossal structures that served as royal tombs for the pharaohs. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, stands as a testament to the architectural prowess and engineering marvels of the ancient Egyptians. Alongside the pyramids, the Sphinx, with its enigmatic visage, continues to captivate the imagination of visitors from around the world. The cultural legacy of ancient Egypt is epitomized by its unique writing system, hieroglyphics, which adorned temples, tombs, and papyrus scrolls. Deciphered by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in the early 19th century, hieroglyphics unlock the secrets of Egypt's rich history, enabling us to understand their religious beliefs, political events, and daily life. Ancient Egypt was a hub of artistic expression, as evident in its intricate sculptures, vibrant paintings, and elaborate jewelry. The delicate craftsmanship of golden burial masks, such as that of Tutankhamun, and the breathtaking reliefs adorning temple walls transport us to a bygone era of artistic opulence. The reverence for the afterlife permeated all aspects of ancient Egyptian society. Elaborate burial rituals, mummification, and the construction of monumental tombs ensured a prosperous journey into the eternal realm. The Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, with their hidden treasures and exquisite funerary art, offer a glimpse into the profound beliefs and spiritual practices of this ancient civilization. Throughout its history, ancient Egypt experienced periods of conquest and influence. The New Kingdom saw the expansion of Egyptian influence across the Near East and the rise of powerful pharaohs, while the late period witnessed the influx of foreign powers such as the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, each leaving their unique imprint on the land of the pharaohs. As we unravel the mysteries of ancient Egypt, We unlock the secrets of a civilization steeped in wonder, wisdom, and cultural achievements. Join us on this extraordinary voyage through time as we uncover the legacy of the Nile Valley and delve into the captivating world of ancient Egypt, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity and the timeless pursuit of greatness. That's it, and that's all.
Thank you, dear fellow time traveler of knowledge, for watching this video. Now please hit the like button and subscribe to this artificial history channel to receive more videos like this one.
By doing this, you give me 1 cent of your attention. Thank you and have a nice day.